Disease is typically an accelerated form of aging. It's like you've got the pedal to the metal and you're just maximally increasing the destruction of your biology. Hopefully, as we get smarter and we integrate much of the intelligence explosion that we're about to experience into our life, people will understand that there's ways to mitigate this electronically so that we don't have to have this almost universal negative impacts of the EMF exposure on our biology that we can mitigate in some ways cleverly with electronics. This collusion with the journals, the medical journals that have been co-opted, essentially massive conflict of interest so that they use the journals as mouthpieces for their flawed science. And it doesn't, you don't have to be a genius to see that.
Hey folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up though, our spaces are filling up very quickly. Welcome. We have with us the great Dr. Joe Mercola with us. Thanks for doing this. He's in the wonderful warm climes of Florida, which I'm very jealous at. I was just in Portugal last week, so that was kind of sort of in between. It wasn't quite as warm, but it was nicer where I'm at Washington. So, Dr. Mercola, you have a new book out as well. It's called Cellular Health, which I have a copy right there. So
There you go.
It's a new topic you wanted to delve into. So I guess maybe we'll start with it. Well, why don't we, before we just do that, your background a little bit. A lot of people know who you are. I mean, you've been doing this stuff for decades now, but what's your overall background, and then we can get into maybe some of the new topics.
Well, I'm trained as a family physician, treated tens of thousands of people until I pivoted to a broader audience on the internet because I thought my mission was to help as many people as I can. I've helped probably hundreds of millions of people through the over 25 years I've been online. So, and I've been active in seeking to identify strategies to understand the foundational causes of why we get sick and provide simple, inexpensive alternatives to the drug paradigm and surgery. So
you think
that's
about
what I compiled in this book. It's literally a compilation of the 50 years I've been passionate about health and optimizing health and coming and recognizing that the more you study it, the simpler the solutions are. And I've really kind of helped people understand that there's really just a few basic things that destroy human biology. If you address those and apply the things that most of us know about, but these other ones are somewhat hidden and obscure, and they're very well camouflaged by the massive propaganda campaigns that are typically done by big industries, not only pharma but the food.
Let me ask you, I mean, because this is I think an interesting discussion here. What's the difference between aging and disease? Because we do age irrespective. I mean, none of us live forever. Even if you did everything perfect, you're still going to age. So how do we distinguish what's normal aging versus I'm getting more and more disease and I feel like garbage? Because I found that I was bought into the, you're 40, you're 50, you're going to feel a certain way. Things aren't going to work as well. And that's normal aging, but really it's not in many ways. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, disease is typically an accelerated form of aging. It's like you've got the pedal to the metal and you're just maximally increasing the destruction of your biology. So, but you're right, we generally tend to degrade as we age, and many of those processes can be slowed down considerably, more than we really know or fully appreciate at this point. And many of it addresses the foundational reasons why biology degrades. And I discuss that extensively in the book. And it has to do with some of the original theories on this came out in the 1950s, right about the year I was born, and it was the free radical theory of aging by Dennis Harman, I think it's like 52 or 53. And that's been refined over time, but essentially it's this oxidative stress that destroys all your cellular components, like your DNA, your cell membranes, your mitochondria, proteins, and some of that can be irreparable, but our bodies are designed to continuously improve and regenerate and heal as long as you give them the tools that it needs and you minimize the exposure to the toxic influences.
So, and as you know, we have a natural redox system. We have our endogenous antioxidants, superoxide dismutase and glutathione and so on and so forth. So what are the things we need for that to occur? And what are the things that are getting in the way of that?
Well, you need cellular energy. That's the title of my book. It's understanding how your body creates cellular energy that allows you to answer that question. And it's not a simple answer. There's a lot of complexities to it. We need a lot of things actually to do that well. But the primary fuel, there's a lot of confusion on. Many people have vilified, and I think the camp that you've been a part of for a long time has done that, where the carbs were the enemy, that they are really responsible for all the problems because I perceive them as the innocent victim at a fire. It's almost in some ways like the firemen appear every time there's a fire, so you could potentially blame the firemen for causing the fire. But no, because glucose is associated frequently. I mean, insulin resistance, elevated glycohemoglobins, age glycosylated proteins. These are all elevated as a result of elevated glucose, but that's just a symptom. That's an artifact of the underlying pathology which leads to that. So they're an innocent bystander, and paradoxically, lower levels of glucose can accelerate that process. That's one of the ways that it can do, and it does it through this redox imbalance. In fact, I've written a few papers on it. I've written 5 papers in the last 8 weeks or so, and 2 of them have just been accepted and they're published. And one of them is on the redox balancing with LA ingestion, and that's LA is short for linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fat, often a polyunsaturated fat, that is really at the crux of it. It's the primary fat that's in vegetable oils, which have been produce these refined, highly processed vegetable oils that are the primary source of calories for most people. And when you go over 2%, I mean, you really should not be eating more than 2% of your total daily calories as this omega-6 fat. And when you do, this oxidative stress just rises dramatically and increases this damage to all your important cellular tissues.
Yeah, there's a fellow, I don't know if you know Chris Kenobi. He's an ophthalmologist who has talked quite extensively about that. And there's a lot of people that are on this, anti-seed oil crusade, I suppose. And it seems like it's obviously, you've seen, last time we talked, RFA got confirmed, and he has actually talked about that pretty extensively. So we're seeing more and more. I mean, whatever humans are designed to eat, it clearly ain't that, because that stuff only came into wide distribution in the last 100 years. So we just have never processed that as human species until very recent modern times. So you can certainly make the argument that it's not a part of our natural diet. Now, there are people out there that will use the current literature, the epidemiology, will say, well, the outcomes are better when you eat, soybean oil versus butter. And there's this, I don't know if you just saw a recent paper came out. I guess it was the industry kind of kicking back on this, saying that vegetable oils are better than butter with certain outcomes. It's another one of these, I think, associative studies. Have you seen that study by chance, or I don't know if you've seen that?
I have not. I'm sure it's fatally flawed in one, if not more than multiple ways. Because that just violates every foundational piece of biology.
And I think your point about we have to have glucose. I mean, if we don't have glucose, we're dead. I mean, I eat little to no glucose, and my glucose is never 0. I mean, it's it may not be 150, but it's more likely 90 or something like that, but it's never 0. And I do agree with you that it may not be the carbohydrate, but what they may be packaged with may be problematic. And as most of the carbohydrates that the humans consume these days are complete junk. I mean, I think that's a fair statement.
And what do you think the most common thing they're packaged with is dangerous?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you look at the trifecta for me is like the donut, because it's seed oils, refined grains, and it's some sort of sugar, refined sugar.
Donuts and French fries, 100%.
Yeah, those are probably the worst foods.
The thing that most of my perspective, the thing it's packaged with is vegetable oils.
Very often, yeah.
That's it. And then not all carbs are healthy. I'm a firm believer that highly processed carbs are not every bit as pernicious. I think the linoleic acid is far more pernicious. But high fructose corn syrup is not your friend in any way, shape, or form. And it will accelerate many of the similar pathologies that omega-6 fats do, which is the primary one. One of the primary ones is fatty liver disease. Both elevated fructose, and polyunsaturated fats will do the same thing.
And do you think that's to the extent that they're consumed in excess? Because some people will say this is a pure hypercaloric scenario where you don't see these deleterious things until we reach a threshold of overconsumption. Is that a fair statement, or you think it's independent and any amount it can be harmful?
No, I think it's after a certain level, and especially if you're healthy already, your body's incredibly resilient and can tolerate a lot of abuse. So if you have small amounts, it's going to be virtually unnoticeable, I would think. And fructose by itself isn't pernicious. It's only when it's extracted out of a whole food matrix. So fructose in fruit, like what some people, physicians believe, like Gundry, that even a small dwarf apple is going to be dangerous to your health. No, fruit, I believe, is one of the healthiest foods on the planet, and you can have it almost unlimited. Now, anything in, I mean, nothing's an absolute, but most people would have a hard time having any problems with fruit, unless this is one of the big points of my book, Your Guide to Cellular Health, is that if your microbiome is so disrupted and you have this excess, a massive imbalance in your gut flora, and you have an excess of the bacteria that have a more virulent endotoxin, which is embedded in their cell membranes. It's a protein and a fat connected, but it is a very potent toxin. And if you haven't, and most people have this because of the damage the vegetable oils do, and other toxins. Not the only one. EMS would be another one. Plastics, microplastics are others. That they cause the fundamental cells that line your colon, the colonocytes, to become damaged and then create a microenvironment in the colon which has higher oxygen tensions, and which kills the beneficial bacteria that they're there. And these beneficial bacteria produce a really important fat, a very small fat that anyone who's done keto knows about. It's called butyrate, and it reduces propionate and acetate too. But these fats fuel these colonocytes, and when they start to die, your colonocytes die, and then you got holes, these leaky guts in your colon. You can create this just vicious cycle of damage to your gut that ultimately sets up the scenario that when you do eat these healthy fibers like fruit or grains, sometimes that you'll have the wrong bacteria metabolizing them, and as a result, you get this increase in endotoxin, which causes it's another mitochondrial poison, which continues to further the metabolic destruction.
Yeah, so it's conditional. And I would, I mean, because you see, there's a lot of diabetics that maybe don't do well with fruit and maybe partially mediated through their microbiome. I mean, it seems like, like these foods that previously were thought to be healthy. I mean, 100 years ago, no one would say fruit was bad for you. I mean, because we probably didn't see the chronic disease. And now you've got people that don't tolerate it for whatever reason. I see them still.
That's right.
I still see people.
It's not bad. It's not bad for you, but you always listen to your body. Your body's always right. It's a very rare case where it's not going to be. But if you eat a healthy food, as I said, I firmly believe that if you're healthy, the fruit is one of the healthiest foods for you. But many people cannot tolerate it, and that's a clue. And if the people can't tolerate whole fruit, then they probably won't be able to tolerate fruit juice, which is even worse because it doesn't have the fiber in it. You're going to get more of an insulin spike. I'm not a big fan of fruit juice. I think it's in many ways it's very similar to some. It's not the same as high fructose corn, certainly, but it's the fructose is abstracted out of the food matrix, and as a result, you're going to have a much larger surge and peaks of sugar that are going to result in potentially pathologic insulin responses.
You mentioned, because I know you're quite interested in mitigate some of these things. EMF, electromagnetic forces. You've got you mentioned microtoxins, environmental things. Those are sometimes, well, I don't know, maybe we just don't think about them as much as far as how do we avoid those, because all of us are bombarded with Wi-Fi signals and 5G and 3G and all that stuff. How much of an issue is that? And how do we know? I mean, how do you assess because I don't know if there's a lot of RCTs on these things that have been done in humans. Maybe there have, maybe you know about that. I'm not sure.
No, there's a lot of studies on the EMFs. In fact, I wrote one that I believe is the best book ever written on EMFs. It's called EMF'd. It was published right before COVID came out, 2019. Actually, maybe 2020, but it reviews very extensively, and there's so much literature on this, and it's been disputed, very similar to the way that pharma does things. It's been discredited, and the telecommunications industry, and I go to that in quite depth in that book also. So there's hard science on it, but with respect, there's another book I'm going to write at some point maybe later this year, maybe next year, but it's called the tyranny of convenience. So many of us exchange the convenience for the damage that it does to us because we can't. It's just like smoking. You could smoke a cigarette, 2 cigarettes a day, a pack a day. You're not going to die from lung cancer, as you well know, in weeks, months, years. It takes decades. So, and in many ways, EMS is very similar. It doesn't cause you to have serious symptoms for most everyone. Some people have these incredible hypersensitivities and they are troubled with it acutely. But most of the time it's a chronic pervasive disease. It takes decades before it kills you prematurely. And there are many reported cases of people having brain tumors from just happens to be the acoustic neuroma on the side where they're holding their phone 24/7 almost. So, that's very consistent. So there's many good studies that shows conclusively in my view.
And then one of the latest things that we've been, I guess, learning about, maybe you've known about this ahead of time, is all the microplastics that are showing up in our brain and our testes and all throughout our
Yeah, of
organs, our
course.
urine.
That's another one. That's another one for sure. And interestingly, all of these I've discussed them. There's 4 of them in the book. They all have the same mechanism, and that is they activate the receptor on the cell membrane that causes calcium to go into the cell. When the calcium goes into the cell, it causes the combination of superoxide and nitric oxide to form peroxynitrite, which is a really potent oxidative free radical that damages your cellular tissue. So it's estrogen will do that, microplastics, linoleic acid, omega-6 fats, and EMFs do the same thing. They all have the same identical mechanism. So, but just speaking to your point earlier that you mentioned, most of us are not going to be able to see, heal, or feel this, although we do experience the consequences of it. And the consequences are just right before us. We have an epidemic of all these diseases. We have heart disease, #1 cause of death. Cancer, #2. And then people debate whether they go back and forth. Then you've got diabetes, you go to obesity, you have an epidemic of obesity, dementia, arthritis. So these are pervasive and epidemic levels. Blindness, Chris Kenobi's he wrote a whole book on age-related macular degeneration, the epidemic we've had that never was really described before, for the most part, before 1900. As most heart disease didn't exist. And diabetes was a rarity. And the first heart attack, the documented heart attack in the United States was in 1912. 1912. Wasn't documented before then. It was a rarity. Now it's the #1 cause of death. So how do you find these things before they kill you? You probably are familiar with the #1 cause of heart disease. The #1 symptom of heart disease, you know what it is, right? It's sudden death.
Sudden death,
So
yeah.
it would be useful to find out that you have a problem before then. Now, clearly there's many different ways you can assess coronary disease or artery disease before you die. But wouldn't it be nice to have markers to identify the pathology that's occurring in your biology as a result of exposure to these toxins, that you can catch it early? So one of the things that I'm doing with this book, and I ran into some complications. I had fully intended to have a health coach available to everyone, that can literally dialogue with them, discuss these things. It's kind of like a virtual doctor, and then have a whole lab system to come in to inexpensively, an alternative to the conventional, very expensive lab system. Like one of the best ways to measure your insulin sensitivity and metabolic dysfunction is something called the HOMA-IR. Have you heard of the HOMA-IR before?
Yeah, of course, sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So for those who haven't, you just multiply your fasting insulin times fasting glucose. You come in, you get a number, divide that by 415, and if that product, that the result of that calculation is less than 1, then you probably don't have insulin resistance. Well, it's like less than 1% of the people in this country don't have insulin resistance. So you can do that test, but if you want to do that test, do you know how much it would cost most people to do that test?
Probably a couple $100, I'm guessing.
A couple $100. Yeah. And this test, many don't know. You would know really clearly. The gold standard for measuring insulin resistance, what is it? It's a lab test developed by, I think, Dr. Ralph DeFranco. Peter Attia just interviewed him. He was out of Harvard. He's still alive. And when it's called the glucose.
Euglycemic
clamp,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And hyperglycemic clamp. So he developed it, and shockingly, he had a 3-hour interview with Attia, and they never mentioned once the HOMA-IR test. Never mentioned it. That test, his test, that clamp test, if you were to, if you can't get it, you have to be a research patient to get it. And if you would pay for it, it'd probably be $1,500, $2,000. Takes hours out of your life. You have to go to, you got tubes stuck in you. And this other test is simple, can be done in the lab, but you still, if you were to get this test, you're going to pay, as you said, probably a few $100s. And say you have insurance, and many people will get the test, and then they'll say it's covered, and then you go get the test, and then like 2 months later, you got to be, oh, I'm sorry, it's not covered now because your condition doesn't justify it. So they get a bill for $200. So we're going to be having this test. We're going to be launching it real soon, the HOMA IR test, and hopefully we're going to try to get it for like $10 or free, and with the code system, and the whole and the system will allow you to identify these, and with a whole variety of other tests too, and getting information from the people so that we, like, their conditions, what they're eating, so we can make these correlations. Our intention is to collect the highest demographic collection ever done in human history, combined with this inexpensive blood testing, same testing that you get at LabCorp Quest, identical testing, identical, and for literally a fraction of the price, maybe 90% less expensive, without any doctor's order, and done the convenience of your home, where you'd have to go to get the blood test. You just go and prick your finger a little bit, put it on the card, mail it in, and you get the results for like 90% less. So these are the technologies that we hope to introduce and leverage so that we can give people structures to identify, not only by theory, but know in real world times, to collect the data on your biology to see if you can implement these changes and see if they can make a difference. And other strategies we're going to do is providing therapeutics, like, as I mentioned, these bacteria that you're destroying. Almost all of us are destroying inadvertently by consuming these vegetable oils. Well, they make butyrate. That's one of their major benefits. And when you lower the butyrate production, you have massive problems, because butyrate doesn't affect the guts, it affects your whole body. Inflammation, immune system, the way your brain functions. It's massively important. Well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to take butyrate as a supplement? Wouldn't that be nice? But you can't. You know why? Because no one's ever figured out how to do it. Because first of all, it tastes awful. You'll never get it down. So if you swallow it, it gets absorbed in your small intestine, because it only works in the large intestine. And if you so you can say, well, let's put up the rectum. We can do that, but the rectum's not that large. It's maybe less than a foot. So 10, 12 foot of the large intestine. So you need the butyrate in the entire large intestine to feed those cells, so that your body, you can create an environment so those good bacteria can start to thrive again. So we're coming out with a supplement, and it's patented, the only time released butyrate supplement in the world that I know of, and we have a global patent for it, that will allow people to start to address some of the challenges that result and most of the time, these poisons that are supposed to, they had no idea or understanding of. But even if they do understand, it's really hard to reverse because they're so pervasive. But as I said, once, the end result of those poisons are to mess up your gut microbiome. And the key goal is to restore that microbiome to its optimal balance. And that's a hard thing to do. And in fact, I frequently refer to it as like this addresses your earlier question about aging, is this the black hole cycle of premature death, which is this destruction, the premature destruction of your microbiome that you can't get out of, because it gets worse and worse and worse, and there's no intervention that we've had that can go in there and address that. And if you did have that intervention, I think you can radically achieve longevity. And another thing that I'm working on, have you heard of C15?
Carbon 15 or C15?
No.
What is, sorry.
Well, yeah, C is referring to a carbon, but it's a fat. It's an odd chain saturated fat. Have you heard of that before? Pentadecanoic acid.
I've heard of odd chain saturated fats, definitely. But
well, the big one is C15. That's the most pervasive one. And I just wrote another paper on that too. It hopefully will be out in the next 4 weeks. Probably it's a really good paper, because what this shows is that the C15, actually, I just realized it. I filed a patent on this. I can't release it because the patent's not. I drafted the patent. I think the patent's going to be filed this week, but I can't disclose it without that being filed. So I can't.
Okay, well, we'll skip over that for now.
But anyway, I have a patent on it, and the C15 does marvelous things to improve your biology. And literally, it's available. I mean, we're going to have it as a supplement because you need it in high doses. If you drank about half a gallon of milk or ate a few pound or two of cheese, you would get it. If the source of the dairy was eating grass. If it's grain fed, it will not, because C15 is only in grass. It is not in grains. It is not in grains, and it's C15 is probably more important than omega-3 fat to your biology. More important. There's a researcher, Stephanie Van Watson, who is an epidemiological veterinarian and has done the pioneering research in this and has brought most of it to market. She has a supplement called Fatty 15, which is really far too expensive. It costs $17 a gram, and I think people would benefit from 1 to 2 grams a day. That is unaffordable for most people. So we're in the process of providing that at a very small fraction, hopefully maybe even down to as low as 20, 30 cents a gram. So which is far cry from $17. So anyway, and you don't have to get it as a supplement. You could eat food, but you'd have to have like, 10 glasses of milk to get a gram a day. And this gram a day, I think, is really an important threshold to see these things. But we don't know yet because no one's done studies on this. But the evidence is just, it's one of the most exciting things I've seen is this pentadecanoic acid. It's amazing, absolutely amazing.
Hey, folks, it's Dr. ShawnBaker here. Hey, if you or someone you love is suffering from chronic disease and you're tired of just managing symptoms with potions, pills, and procedures, I want you to check out Revero.com. Our team of dedicated professionals is committed to tackling the root cause of your issue and finally getting you healthy. Hurry up, though. Our spaces are filling up very quickly. What, you mentioned something about longevity, and I'm just, I gotta tell you, I'm pretty skeptical because up to this point, there's been a lot of longevity proponents that have, but no one's ever lived long. I mean, I'm still waiting to see the 120-year-olds walking around that are robust and vigorous. And so, when are we going to see that? What are we supposed to die of? Assuming,
Yeah.
what,
I think ideally you're supposed to die of an accident, for the most
well,
part.
yeah, but that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that many people do, but launch. I think you just give out. Your cells give out. You lose the ability to create cellular energy is when you pass, or you choose to go. But I'm convinced. I'm convinced. I don't have the data for it yet. I will. I think that the C15 could increase longevity by 80% as a max. I think for most people, it'll go 10. So that would mean if you had a newborn and you raised and minimized their exposure to these environmental toxins, and they had sufficient C15, you can get them up to 200 years. Because it's it's a saturated fat. You know that saturated fats cannot be oxidized. That's where almost all the problem is. All these chronic epidemic diseases are because we have too much unsaturated fat in our cell membranes. And it's like it's tinder, and you light the fire, and we're burning all this crazy damage that's occurring because of this excess. And the saturated fat it's almost like a blanket. Of course, it just protects that oxidation. It gets into, are you familiar with cardiolipin?
Yes. Yeah.
That's a fat that's exclusive to the inner mitochondrial membrane, and it's like a triglyceride. It has 3 tails. Cardiolipin has 4 tails, and because of our diet, most of those tails are made of linoleic acid, and this cardiolipin is a really important structural component. It forms these super complexes in the mitochondria. It crowds the complexes 1 through 5 closer together, so that the flow of the electrons are much more easily facilitated, and you can create cellular energy more easily. Well, when you plug in this linoleic acid in the cardiolipin tail, it's like you burn it up, and it self-destructs the mitochondria, which is essential to create cellular energy. So you've got all large portions of our mitochondria dying prematurely because the tails are loaded with linoleic acid. And if you substitute C15 in there, it doesn't do that. It cannot burn. You cannot oxidize a saturated fat. You just can't do it. It's not biologically possible.
So, you talk about the remedies for these problems, but we got to stop the poisoning first, correct? Is that a fair assessment?
Yes,
Because
of course, 100%. Yes. So that's why the number one rule in the books, your guide to cellular health, is to stop the vegetable oils. That's probably the single most important thing you do, but it's hard. It's hard to do. And because it's hidden. Most people have no idea how much they're getting because it's in almost every processed food, is in almost every restaurant you go to, and you have to be super vigilant, almost obsessive compulsive to eliminate from your life. And even the most rigid people, it's tough to get under 10 grams a day, and it's almost the anomaly, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 people ever get it down to 2 grams, which is what our historical norms were.
Yeah, I mean, I don't eat any processed food. I just eat a bunch of, and I guess,
Yeah,
if I were to eat meat
well,
and even fruit doesn't have any linoleic,
no,
or
fruit is
has very
zero,
little.
almost
Yeah.
zero,
Yeah.
almost zero.
So
But
you would
it still
avoid
has
it.
some though.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, most people don't understand, like, fruit has fat in it. There's still some fat in fruit. Most
there
people don't
is.
consider
Yeah.
that. It's a small amount, but it's there.
Yeah, I eat like 4 pounds of watermelon a day typically,
Hmm.
and I'm getting like 1.5 grams of linoleic acid just from that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of water. Well, it's not, I guess it seems like a lot. There's not much to watermelon. It's mostly,
Yeah, yeah,
as you know, it's mostly water, right? So
yeah. That's right. Structured water, interestingly.
structured water. Yeah. So let me,
Yeah.
because I always find it interesting, because I know you're very meticulous about your health, and which is, it's tough to do for a lot of people. But I mean,
Mhm.
I mean, as far as like avoiding EMF, I saw something like, I think I saw somewhere said you were sleeping in an EMF tent or something like
Mhm.
that. Or how do you navigate this modern environment? Because there's that
Well,
stuff everywhere.
that is a bit extreme. Although I'm in the process now. I've got some research team going, and we're actually going to be using, I believe, graphene, aluminum, and copper. Not copper, aluminum, and what is it? Not silver. Is it copper? Aluminum might be copper. I forget the three, but graphene is the key. And we're going to be able to create these EMF shielding materials really inexpensively so that you can put this tent. I have a little tent. It's like a sleeping tent. It's got a really small space, and it's not, I don't mind it, but most people wouldn't tolerate it. But we're going to create these canopies in the bed that actually look good and are relatively inexpensive. So that's easy. But that's still extreme. The most important things you can do is to make sure that your cell phone is in airplane mode most of the time, and not turn on Wi-Fi in your house if you can. And that's it. You just be really. It's not so much that, yes, there's Starlink transmitters circling the globe and bombarding the entire planet with 5G, but that's still not the most common exposure. The most common exposure is from ourselves, the Wi-Fi in our homes and their cell phones. If you address that, you're getting rid of most of it. When I first got online, you won't believe this, in the 70s. I was late 70s. I was actually, well, it depends in the internet online. I was online before then, the 60s, in the late 60s, when I was took my first computer programming class in high school. But it wasn't the internet that we know today. But anyway, the internet before, in the last century, was all wired. It was not wireless at all. And it wasn't until we really hit uh, the iPhone 2007 that wireless became pervasive. And now it's almost no anyone doesn't understand how you could have connection to the internet without wire. I mean, it's just not done. It's everything is wireless.
Yeah, well, definitely the world is changing, and it's going to continue to change. I mean, we've seen, I see Elon Musk talking about we're going to have robots in our house.
Oh yeah, that's
I don't know
coming
if
for sure.
I don't
There's a
know if
lot of
those things are
upheaval in the
emitting
ecosystem.
EMF or what they're doing. Who knows if they're going to be a health
Well,
risk to us? But
these devices do need to be connected to the internet, others don't work. I mean, you can have independent, but most of the power and the intelligence comes from the LLMs, and the LLMs really take a lot of space. Although they're getting better and better, and you can put some pretty clever ones on your phone even that's not connected to the internet, but most of them are going to be connected. And if they're going to get real time information, that's the only place they're going to get it. And these connections are wireless. I mean, yeah, wireless for sure. So yeah, it's coming. It's more and more. But see, the thing is, as you improve your biology, become more resilient, you'll become more resistant to the damage from that. But hopefully, as we get smarter and we integrate much of the intelligence explosion that we're about to experience into our life, that people will understand that there's ways to mitigate this electronically, so that we don't have to have this almost universal negative impacts of the EMF exposure on our biology that we can mitigate in some ways, so cleverly, with electronics. It's doable. Just no one's put the time, effort, and energy and resources because they don't believe it's a problem. That's the issue. But once they understand that and they start directing energy to it, that it can be addressed, so that we can have these convenience without the damage.
Yeah, I'm just, it's interesting because as you mentioned, this sort of trade off for convenience versus health health implications. Because no one wants to give up process. We went, it was the 1950s. You had the one person, the husband worked, the wife stayed at home, cooks the
Mhm.
homemade meals. We've gone from that to processed food. Everybody's working, and now we've gone from, like, when I was a kid, because I grew up in the 70s. I was born in '67, so I grew up in the '70s. I didn't have I didn't have cell phones or internet or
No,
any of that
no one
stuff.
did.
So we didn't know that stuff, but now we've become, like, every kid that's born in the last 30 years has grown up with cell phones and internet. And to say, well, you know, maybe you don't need that. I don't know. You could pull it away from me. I think the genie's out of the bottle on that one. And so,
Well, so cell phones haven't been 30 years. It's closer to 20,
okay,
really. I mean,
something like that. Yeah.
I mean, we had cell phones in the last century for sure, but they didn't. Smartphones is actually what it is. And see, the cell phones back then were a problem, but smartphones are even worse of a problem because you're on them more frequently. But the smartphone didn't happen until 2007 for the most part. There were some before the iPhone, but not many. It was really the iPhone that catalyzed, and that was 2007. So we're still less than 20 years away from that. But 30, I mean, there were phones, yeah, there's no question, but they weren't as pervasive as they are now.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
mean, there's more phones on the planet than there are people.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had several of them. I'm sure. I don't know what happened to them. They
Yeah,
traded them in and they did something to them. So probably,
yeah.
maybe they're in Africa or somebody's using them as a refurbished one or something like that. So back to your book, Cellular Health. One of the things you mentioned on the title, it says Unlocking the Science of Longevity and Joy, which is an
Mhm.
interesting concept in the garden, because most people, when they talk about health, they don't really talk about joy very much. Why did you include that in the title?
Well, great question. It's because my next book, which is The Power of Choice, I think that's the next one that comes out. Although I'm writing so many books, I've got a whole series on the cure books. I just finished the fat cure, and now we got the gut cure one, then we got the gut cure two, and the iron cure. There's so many different topics that, and most of them I've written a paper about, and then we have a book that follows up that translates the science into something you can understand. But with getting back to the joy, I fully believe that one of the primary ways that you can connect to yourself, your intuition, your gut, your spirit, someone would call, is to have optimal biological energy. So that's the primary reason I wrote Cellular Health, is to allow people to generate more energy, because if they have more energy, your biology is going to be working to the point where you can start to connect yourself again, start to who you truly are. And it's when you do that, you are able to successfully achieve, you're more likely, not able to, you're more likely, you increase the likelihood of being able to successfully achieve why I believe all of us came here, chose to come here, which is to create with joy. To create with joy. That's what that is our, that's the reason we came here. It's simple, it's basic, but to attain joy. And when you're in an experience of, and this is not happiness. Joy is completely distinct from happiness. They're totally separate, because happiness is typically ephemeral, short lasting. It is not necessarily authentic, that addresses the reason why you came down to create. So I believe that's the reason, and our primary focus is to help people to connect back to themselves. And it's almost impossible when your biology is so devastated. Just thinking about the brain, because that's how we think, right? It's our mind, isn't it? It's in there, but the brain consumes 2% of your body weight. Yeah, it consumes 20% of your energy. 20% of your energy. So if you're not able to create enough energy, your brain's not going to work, and how can you function well? And so many people are impaired because of that. So it's the principles in the book really are designed to address that.
Yeah, let me shift gears a little bit, because you mentioned, having adequate energy or producing energy correctly. How does exercise, because most people think of exercise as withdrawing energy. We utilize energy to exercise, but I think exercise is good for us. I think you would agree with that, perhaps.
Well,
How does
I
that
was been
impact
exercising
energy?
since I was been exercising since before you were born. 1968 is when I started.
There you go. I was born in
I
'67,
haven't.
so I was a baby.
Oh, darn! I thought it was okay. It was close. It was close. Yeah, so almost by a year. But I'm a firm believer in exercise. I would never stop it. I'd do it. I had to, I actually, because I was lifting really, I think it was because I lived, who knows what it was, but maybe it wasn't enough, not enough collagen in one of my early days. It's like most people. But I wound up getting a double inguinal hernia. And I just had a surgical repair just recently. And you're a surgeon, so you're quite familiar with that. But I had to take literally almost 2 months off before I did any significant movement. And that was the longest time in my life I've ever been off. I've never been off more than a week, I think, ever in my life. But that was just devastating to me because I love the exercise. But I think it's essential. It's you can not do exercise and still be pretty healthy, but you can never really opt in healthy with exercise. You need to move. And what I think the best exercise is simple. I think I'm a big fan of resistance training as you are, but I think if you're doing a lot of resistance training, you're not doing this, you are missing the boat, and you better stop some of the resistance training and do the basic one, which everyone needs, which is walking.
Mm.
Simple walking doesn't cost anything. Everyone can do it, unless you're, of course, handicapped and you have some type of disability. And it's sad because your health will suffer if you're unable to walk. Your movement, your mobility, flexibility, your immune system, everything's connected to movement. And, it doesn't have to be walking. It could be dancing. Sometimes when I walk on the beach, I'm dancing, just because it's a good movement and it feels good. So sometimes people find it a little bit embarrassing in public, but I don't mind. And, it's just movement. So dance can do it, yoga, just movement is important. Walking just is the simplest and easiest to do, though.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely designed to move, and I using like if you use the analogy of a lot of people like to use the analogy of a car, and they talk about keeping their engine, heart and lungs are the engine, but
Mhm.
really the body is the chassis. And if your body starts falling apart, your heart and lungs, you can't do it. If you, like I said, if you limp around everywhere, you're not going to be able to stimulate heart and lung function.
No.
So you got to keep that body moving and use it or lose it type of thing. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
Sunshine, the sun is the universal source or the originating source of all energy in our solar system. How does sunlight impact our health?
Oh, it's enormously important in so many different ways. Sleep is one, circadian rhythm optimization. So if you ideally, you're getting up, you're going to bed around sunset or before sunset. Ideally, I'm always in bed before sunset, and you get up before sunrise. So, but if you got this things mixed, if you're sleeping really late at night and getting up, at noon, that doesn't work too well. But when you're in the sun, I believe sun exposure is a requirement for optimized human biology. Very similar to exercise, and that's why have it's March and I'm still tan now at this point because I go out there every day at solar noon. Not and now solar noon because we're in daylight savings times, which I don't follow. I'm just like Arizona and Hawaii and certain parts of Indiana. I choose not to follow daylight savings time. So I go to bed at 6 o'clock at night in the winter, and I go to bed at 7 o'clock at night in the summer because I live in a state that follows daylight savings times. But I don't change my circadian biology. So, but the reason I'm out of solar noon is that's the maximum amount of sun energies that you can get into your system. And I believe and I discuss it in my book, there's something called photometabolism. It's the name I gave to it, where you can actually extract energy from the sun, integrate it into your biology, and very similar to some type of food where you're actually capturing electrons and shuttling them to the electron transport chain. And because that's when you're eating food, ultimately food is a sort fats and carbohydrates primarily. They're ultimately metabolized to electrons that are shuttled through the electron transportation and combined with oxygen in complex 4 to generate ATP out of complex 5. So you can do that with the sun exposure. Now you have to be a bit careful, and I didn't understand this until I wrote the book, and I had this epiphany and realized that this linoleic acid gets embedded in your cell membranes, these vegetable oils, and if you are like a normal person, you haven't paid any attention to it, you're 100% guaranteed you are oversaturated with these fats, and it would not be wise unless you're an African American and have really deeply pigmented skin to go out in the sun because it's solar noon, because you'll get damage. You'll get photo aging on your skin. You'll wrinkle prematurely, and you can get skin cancer. You definitely can. I was always disparaging the dermatologists for discouraging people to do that, but they were wise. They were wise, and I realized that just recently that is an appropriate precaution. So it doesn't mean because of the exposure to these vegetable oils, we're very susceptible to this type of damage. So I don't think it's a wise idea to get this solar new exposure unless you've detoxed and have been off of seed oils, vegetable oils for at least 6 months. And so that would be a wise strategy, I think. Now, it doesn't mean you shouldn't get any sun. I just don't think you should be out at solar noon, or maybe 2 hours before solar noon, 2 hours after, and stay out of that window because there's too much sun energy. But if your tissue can tolerate, you certainly can. Anyone who hasn't been taking any vegetable oils like yourself and eating food that is virtually devoid. I mean, most meat, even grain-fed meat. Now, I'm talking about ruminant animal meat, not non-ruminant animal. There's a big difference because ruminants have biohydrogenation chambers in their stomach. They have multiple stomachs, and there's bacteria in those stomachs that literally are little factories that saturate polyunsaturated fats. So that's why beef is so low in linoleic acid. That's why sheep and goats are so low. But that's why chickens and pork are really high, because they do not have that chamber. So they have much more linoleic acid. So as long as you're eating ruminant animals, you're golden. That's is the best type of meat to get. That's the meat that we were designed to get, and that's where typically you're going to get C15 too, because it's the ruminant animals that do it from beef that are eating grass, not grains, eating grass.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, here in the U.S., I mean, our chicken consumption has gone up 700-800% in the last 50 years, whereas beef consumption has dropped 30-40%, and we've seen a rise. I mean, that's probably one of many factors that have led to this rise in chronic disease. With the sun, I mean, this is something, that I'd heard people talking about, improved sun tolerance by going, carnivore or something like that, where they're cutting out seed oils. And a lot of people, Tucker Goodrich has been talking about this stuff for years. He's been ridiculed about it, but it seems to hold up for a lot of people. They say, I just don't burn as easily.
Yeah.
And
another thing too is migraines too.
Hmm.
A lot of people have migraines, but then they didn't realize until recently that was largely related to seed oils too.
I've seen that in some people talking about sodium channels. Maybe salt had an impact on migraines as well. What do you think are the biggest mistakes that the medical industrial complex, if I can say that, has done? Like you said, the dermatologists, maybe they were right, but for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
What are the biggest things we're getting wrong in medicine right now?
Well, I think the over-reliance on Rockefeller medicine, which is essentially identifying that drugs are the solution for every symptom that you have.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's really mostly profit motivated. Very rarely is it, and this collusion with the journals, the medical journals, that have been co-opted, essentially massive conflict of interest, so that they use the journals as mouthpieces for their flawed science. And it doesn't you don't have to be a genius to see that. The most egregious examples being like in COVID, where they would publish these ridiculous trials that were clearly in very prestigious high impact journals that like Lancet, I think it was one of them. I was pretty sure it was, where they have these published these trials on maybe it was ivermectin, I think was one of them, and others where they're just proving it, and it was all flawed stuff. It was all flawed. I mean, it's just fudged data that they had to retract the study. So I mean, this is egregious. But there's most of the studies. In fact, you have Marshall Angell, who was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, the highest impact journal in the world, and she wrote a book in 2007. I forget the name of the title, but it's really eye-opening. This is the editor of the most prestigious medical journal in the world says it's conflicted. You can't trust them. I mean, what more respectable, credentialed clinician could you have than that person saying it? But so it's the implementation of that aberration that I think is pervasive and probably one of the most dangerous philosophies that's adopted widely.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is something I think when you look at what is a physician, what is a doctor, what is a healer, and we have this very narrow slice that we're trained on. When the reality is it's nutrition and lifestyle and sleep and circadian biology and probably a handful of other things that we should have expertise in, but we don't. All we have is expertise in this very narrow, profitable source of portion of health, which is pills and procedures. And as a physician, you should have good comprehension, not only just appreciation, but some level of expertise in some of these other things. And none of us do, because we weren't trained on it. We had to find it out ourselves, I think, in many ways.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that's probably the biggest. But just the lack of integration. We've gotten to the system that it's almost impossible because of the requirement for almost any trained medical physician to pay their bills, to spend more than 15 minutes, in many cases 5 minutes, with the patient. It's literally physically impossible to fully assess what's going on and intervene in a way that's going to ever address the foundational cause of disease. It's impossible to do, and we've essentially created a scenario that they cannot win. The new physicians, they cannot win unless you completely opt out of the system and go rogue. It's the
Yeah,
only way to do it.
I agree with you. I think I can remember practicing as an orthopedist when I would have 50 patients on my schedule. I mean, I mean, obviously I'm there to check on their incisions and wounds, and
Yeah,
but I mean, if I were wanting to have a discussion on lifestyle, I mean,
it
I
ain't
got
gonna happen.
5 minutes,
Yeah,
no support,
yeah,
no incentive, mostly disincentive, and no support. So, yeah, you're right. It's not, the system is not designed for us to do what we should be doing as physicians. I mean, it's
yeah.
there to be kind of subcontractors for the pharmaceutical industry, I think, in many ways. Well, Dr. Mercola, unfortunately, we are almost out of time, and it's been wonderful chatting with you. Where, I know you got, I guess, websites, latest books, whatever you want to let us know about. Where can we
Yeah, it's
find that stuff?
Mercola.com. My last name, Mercola.com. And we have a health coach. It's in development, put it that way. We've had a little bit of a challenge in implementing this, but it's going to come out real soon. So the health coach will be out there coming soon, and you can get us both ways. But Mercola.com is the place to go.
All right. Well, as usual, thank you so much, Dr. Mercola. I look
You're
forward to
welcome.
seeing what you come up with next, and
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll talk again. Appreciate
All
it.
right.
Thank
Thanks a
you.
lot, Shawn. Take care.